Today we're taking a look at a game between Garry Kasparov and Vdoven. This game was played in Moscow back in 1979. Now, I couldn't find much information about this opponent, but I could find one other game where he drew against Garry, so one would have to assume that he's a very strong player. Okay, let's get into it. Garry has the white pieces and he starts with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3. So Garry is allowing the Nimzo Indian, which is not as common these days at the top level. A lot of players with the white pieces try to avoid the Nimzo and instead play knight f3 and go for a Catalan, but Garry allows it. Bishop to b4, so now we have the Nimzo Indian defense. One of the richest openings in all of chess when it comes to strategic concepts for both the black side and the white side. Garry plays e3, so this is commonly referred to as the Rubinstein variation. Castles, knight to e2. Garry is looking to reinforce his queenside knight with his kingside knight. d5, a3, asking the question of the bishop, and the bishop retreats to e7. We have an exchange of pawns in the center of the board. Now we have what is known as the Carlsbad structure, which people might be familiar with from the Queen's Gambit Declined. However, there's a few key differences that we need to note. First of all, this dark squared bishop for white is inside the pawn chain, whereas when you might see this same type of pawn structure in the Queen's Gambit Declined, that bishop is usually on g5 or f4. In the Carlsbad structures, white usually either plays for the minority attack by launching his b-pawn up the board to create weaknesses, or he goes for a central break with f3 and e4. However, in this game, Garry has different ideas. He plays g3, we have c6, and bishop to g2. Now we have knight to a6 from black. He's looking to route his knight into c7 and then e6, where it would have some nice influence in the center of the board. Castles from Garry, knight to c7, and h3. This is a curious looking move at first, but we will very quickly see the point of it. Knight to e6, and at this stage we have a fairly fresh game according to the databases. So back in 1979, we can well and truly conclude that both players were out of prep at this stage and likely on their own at the board. g4 from Garry. With this move, we see Kasparov's idea behind the pawn move h3. He was preparing to expand on the king side with g4. And it looks like Kasparov is aiming to play this position kind of like a King's Indian attack. Playing g4 means that he now has the g3 square for his knight to slot into, and it looks like he's just wanting to expand on the king side and go for a bloodthirsty kingside attack. It looks like we have an exciting game coming up. Bishop to d6 from black, and f4. Garry is just launching his kingside pawns up the board. Now notice that black has a number of his pieces in front of the pawns here, which could prove to be a bit problematic. On the other hand, white has all of his minor pieces behind the pawns. This is quite a common approach that we see in d4 openings. Black plays g6, and his idea is that he's giving himself the g7 square for that knight to slot back into. Knight to g3, and black plays knight to g7, getting his knight out of the way, and also getting some nice light square influence with his bishop. Even though it's not currently developed, it is now playing a key role in guarding that f5 square. And now, in this position, Garry plays a move that I don't think would even cross the minds of a single club player. We typically only see titled players play these types of moves. He plays knight to h1, moving his knight into the corner of the board. I don't think a single club player in the entire world would have played this move. It might even be one of the very last moves that appear in the candidates list for a lot of club players, who have probably heard the saying, "A knight on the rim is very dim." Well, if a knight on the rim is dim, how about a knight all the way in the corner of the board? Kasparov has big ambitions for this knight actually. He wants to continue expanding on the king side, pushing his pawns forward. But we can see that it's a bit difficult to achieve that at the moment. f5 is very well covered at the moment by the black pieces, and pushing h5 would need some preparation because that would leave g4 hanging in many situations. And the immediate g4 would leave a nice hole here for black on h5 where he'd be able to clog things up with his knights. So Kasparov has a few ideas with this move actually. He first wants to get his bishop to f3, where he has coverage of h5, making it possible to play g5. And he also wants to get his knight closer towards that black king, using the g4 square as a bit of a launch pad for that. Okay, let's move on with the game. Black plays bishop to c7. Actually a very nice and classy move from black. He has his eyes set on the e4 square. He wants to route his knight that's on g7 at the moment to d6, where he'll have influence with his knights on e4. As we can see, this is a bit of a hole at the moment. White would love to eventually play e4. So this move, bishop to c7, vacates the d6 square so that the black knight can use it. Okay, we have knight to f2, knight to e8, as explained. Black is looking to get his knight into d6. Bishop to f3, preparing g5 now that he has some coverage on the h5 square, preventing black from moving his knight to h5. Knight to d6. We now have the two knights eyeing that very important e4 square, and Kasparov now plays g5 just in time actually to kick the knight back. Black doesn't quite have enough control of the e4 square to be able to jump in with his knight. As we can see, there are already 3 pieces of whites defending that square. Jumping in immediately would simply just lose a pawn. So this move g5 comes just in time to kick the knight back to e8. Kasparov leaps into g4 with his knight, getting much closer to the black king. Black plays f6, looking to immediately strike that advanced structure of whites. And Kasparov jumps in with his knight, knight to h6 check, getting his pieces very close to the black king now. The king steps forward, king to g7, and h4, reinforcing his advanced pawn that is protecting his knight. And now it is one of the critical moments of the game actually. In the game, black played bishop to f5, which is a very understandable move actually. Black really wants to fight for this e4 square and to make sure that white doesn't crash through in the center of the board by playing e4 himself. In the actual game, we'll get to see what is wrong with this approach from black, but let's just go back to this position here and have a quick look at what the engine is recommending here for black. We can see that the top engine recommendation actually is to immediately challenge this knight on h6. So playing a move such as knight to f5 or even knight to f7. There are some nuances in this position where the engine prefers knight to f5, but as a general rule of thumb, whenever you see a piece on your side of the board, so if we cut the board into 2 halves here, so we've got black's half of the board and white's half of the board. When we think about the board in this perspective, in terms of my half and your half, we can see that this white piece here, the knight on h6, is very deep in black's territory. As a general rule of thumb, when you have a piece deep within your territory, it's generally a good idea to just look to evict it as quickly as you possibly can. And the idea of this move, knight to f5, is essentially just to immediately challenge that white knight and boot it out of his house. Okay, let's go back to the game continuation where black instead played bishop to f5, looking to get some control of the e4 square. Kasparov plays queen e2, and he's looking to get his queen involved on the king's side, where she can shuffle across either to g2 or h2, depending on the situation. Queen to e7. Again, black is concentrating his forces on this e4 square. Kasparov plays queen to g2, lining his queen against the black monarch. Black takes on g5, looking to get some additional influence and activity for his rook on f8. And now black plays king to h8, multi-purpose move. First, getting his king off that file, which was being x-rayed by the queen. And he's also vacating the g7 square for his knight. In these types of closed positions, that idea of vacating squares for other pieces is a common approach that you'll see from a lot of titled players. Bishop to d2, Kasparov is developing. Knight to g7. Rook to c1, getting the rook onto a nice half-open file. And now black plays one of the most natural-looking moves that I know a lot of club players would play. He jumps into e4 with his knight. That glorious-looking outpost. He has played so many moves this game to try to get control of that square. And finally, he seems to have some level of control. And he jumps into that outpost. I think that, probably 90% of club players would be playing a move like this. And it turns out to be that it's actually a pretty serious strategic mistake. But it's not entirely obvious at first. So let's let Garry Kasparov show to us why jumping into this outpost was a strategic mistake. Such a natural looking move. He takes that knight, he recaptures with the pawn, attacking the bishop, and the bishop slots back to e2. So can we see now why jumping into e4 with the knight was a strategic mistake? Well, the first one is that pawn that was on d5 is now on e4. So what does that mean? It means that we have a new avenue to attack the black king. This diagonal here is actually very accessible to the white pieces. That bishop can land on c4 very easily. But that is just one of the points. Actually, there's one more, even more important point of why that pawn being on e4 is a big strategic liability now for black. And I won't spoil the fun because Garry Kasparov will show us what that other point is. Black plays bishop to d6 and Kasparov takes over that glorious diagonal with bishop to c4. We have a5 from black looking to expand on the queen side. He is looking to play b5 and push that bishop back and potentially start opening up some lines on the queen side. Kasparov plays bishop to a2 in anticipation of b5. And black plays bishop to e6 looking to challenge that light square bishop. He decides that the light square bishop of whites is just simply too powerful and it needs to be exchanged off. Kasparov takes the bishop. Black retakes with his queen. And now in this position here, Kasparov shows us the real dangers that came with black's knight to e4 move and the transfer of the d5 pawn onto e4. He plays an absolutely incredible move. d5, double exclamation mark, a pawn sacrifice. The pawn can be taken by either the c6 pawn or the queen. There is no piece of white that is defending that pawn. It is a purely positional pawn sacrifice. Black takes it with his c-pawn, and now we can see the issue here. Bishop to c3. That bishop that was so sad. If we go back a few moves here to this position, let's go back to before knight to e4 was played. Look at how sad this bishop is. All of the pawns are on dark squares. It's very hard to imagine how that bishop gets active and plays an influential role in the game. But now after that knight hop, we can see that this bishop that was so sad on d2 has now become an incredibly powerful asset. Look at this piece. It is x-raying the black king. The knight is pinned. And I don't see how that knight can ever get out of that pin because the white knight on h6 is controlling the light squares here. So black can't really get out of this pin. He's essentially a piece down now. That knight is just eternally pinned. There's no way of breaking that pin. And we can see from the engine evaluation, the engine is giving this as plus 2.0 for white. Almost a piece up, basically, with even material. But the computer can also see that black is essentially playing a piece down here. Black plays rook to c8 with the idea of sacrificing the exchange to remove that incredibly beastly dark squared bishop. Kasparov plays bishop to d4. He is not allowing black to sack the exchange. Black insists. He plays rook to c4. He is desperate to try to sack the exchange to get rid of that monstrous dark squared bishop. But of course, Kasparov sees that his bishop on d4 is way more important than a rook right now. So Kasparov removes that rook on c4. Black retakes with the pawn. And now we have queen to d2. And in this position here, Kasparov is threatening an absolutely crushing combination. Do you see what that is? Well, black plays b6. He has no idea what's coming. And Kasparov now plays the absolutely crushing and unexpected bishop takes g7. Black must have been completely blind to this move because that bishop on d4 was so incredibly powerful, and that knight was eternally pinned and basically worthless. So why is Kasparov giving up such a powerful piece for such a weak piece? Well, tactics, that is why. The black king must retake, and now we have queen to d4 check. And now we can see the point of the combination. The black king is essentially trapped. He can't go to any of the light squares because the knight on h6 is guarding those squares, and the queen and the pawns cover the dark squares. Have a look at this. All of the interception points to block this check are covered by pawns, but there's nothing else to do. The black king can't move. He plays rook to f6 to intercept the check. Black's idea is that if white were to take the rook, then he'd lose contact with the knight, which means that the knight can capture on h6. So that is black's idea here, but Kasparov, of course, does not go for that. He plays f5, double exclamation mark. And in this position here, the rook is under attack. The queen is under attack. Notice that the rook is pinned as well, so it can't just capture that pawn and sacrifice in that way because of this pin along the dark square long diagonal. So is there anything that black can do? He tries playing counter-attacking the white queen, but Kasparov simply captures black's queen, and black thinks that he's getting away with things here. He throws in rook to f1 check, forcing the king to recapture. So he has saved his rook that was being threatened by that white pawn. Black takes the white queen, but in this position here, Kasparov does not recapture the bishop. He plays e7 exclamation mark. And in this position here, black resigned because there is no stopping that pawn from queening. The knight still covers the crucial f7 square that prevents the king from getting closer to the pawn. So whatever black does, that next move, Kasparov is creating a new queen. Okay, what an absolutely fascinating game here that Garry Kasparov played all the way back in 1979. Thank you everyone for watching the video. And as always, if you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.